Some mornings, Jack Halden wondered if he was failing his daughter the same way he'd failed his wife. The weight of single parenthood pressed down on him like the ocean depths he used to know so well. Walking the empty beach with 6-year-old Emma, he spotted something unusual in the sand, a massive rusted chain, each link bigger than his fist. A calm voice in his head whispered, "Follow it." Jack thought he was losing his mind until Emma, who hadn't spoken since her mother died, began drawing pictures of the same chain leading to a woman beneath the waves. The locals called it the Promise, a legend about a lighthouse keeper who made a deal with the ocean a century ago. As Jack begins uncovering the chain, he realizes it stretches impossibly far into the sea. Each link he unearths seems to pull him deeper into both an ancient mystery and his own buried grief. But what happens when following that voice means Jack might have to choose between his daughter's future and his wife's memory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Jack Halden's front porch as he sat with his second cup of coffee, watching Emma through the kitchen window. She hunched over her small table, completely absorbed in her drawing, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. The same intense concentration she'd inherited from her mother, along with those thoughtful brown eyes that seemed to see more than a 6-year-old should. 2 years ago, Jack had been one of the most sought-after deep-sea salvage divers on the Pacific coast. His reputation for finding lost ships, recovering valuable cargo, and navigating the most treacherous underwater conditions had earned him contracts from insurance companies, maritime museums, and private collectors. The work had been dangerous but rewarding, both financially and professionally. More importantly, it had given him the flexibility to be present for Sarah and Emma in ways that a traditional 9-to-5 job never could have. Then came that rainy October evening when everything changed. Sarah had been driving home from her book club meeting, taking the winding coastal road she'd traveled hundreds of times before. A logging truck had jackknifed on the wet asphalt, and Sarah's small sedan had nowhere to go. The impact killed her instantly, the state trooper had said, as if that detail might somehow lessen Jack's anguish. But it wasn't just the suddenness of her death that destroyed him. It was the knowledge that he could have prevented it. Sarah had called him that evening, asking if he could pick her up because the rain was getting worse. Jack had been in his workshop, meticulously cleaning and organizing his diving equipment after a successful salvage operation. "I'm almost done here," he'd told her. "Just drive carefully, okay? I'll have dinner waiting." Those were the last words he'd spoken to his wife. The guilt had consumed him like a slow poison. Within 6 months, he'd lost 3 major contracts due to his inability to focus underwater. Word spread quickly in the tight-knit salvage community that Jack Halden had lost his edge, that the grief had made him unreliable. The final blow came when he'd had a panic attack during a routine recovery dive, forcing his team to abort the mission and costing the client thousands of dollars. Now, nearly 2 years later, Jack survived on odd jobs around Millhaven: boat repairs, dock maintenance, occasional fishing guide work for tourists who didn't know his reputation. The small coastal town of 8,000 residents had been Sarah's choice for raising Emma, and despite the painful memories embedded in every familiar street and storefront, Jack couldn't bring himself to leave. This was where Sarah had planted her garden, where she'd taught Emma to ride a bicycle, where their life together had felt complete. Their rental house sat on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, close enough to hear the waves but far enough from the main beach to avoid the summer crowds. Sarah had loved the isolation, the way the salt air carried the scent of wild roses from her carefully tended garden. Now the roses grew wild and untamed, and Jack found himself oddly comforted by their chaotic beauty, as if Sarah's nurturing spirit had found a way to persist without her physical presence. Emma hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the family physician who delivered Emma and cared for the Halden family for years, assured Jack that selective mutism following trauma was not uncommon in children. "She understands everything," Dr. Reeves had explained. "Her cognitive development is perfectly normal. She's simply processing her grief in her own way." But understanding the clinical explanation didn't make the silence any easier to bear. Emma had been such a chatterbox before Sarah's death, full of questions about everything from why the ocean was blue to whether angels really had wings. Now she communicated through nods, gestures, and most eloquently through her drawings. The child was extraordinarily gifted with a pencil and paper. Even before losing her mother, Emma had shown remarkable artistic ability, but her recent work possessed an almost otherworldly quality. She drew with an intensity and precision that seemed far beyond her years, creating detailed images that often left Jack unsettled. Ocean scenes dominated her sketchbook: waves, shells, underwater gardens of kelp, and always women with flowing hair floating beneath the surface. Mrs. Chen, their 78-year-old neighbor, had become an unexpected lifeline. The retired librarian had appeared at their door 3 days after the funeral with a casserole and an offer to help with Emma whenever Jack needed it. What had begun as emergency childcare had evolved into something approaching family. Mrs. Chen possessed infinite patience with Emma's silence and seemed to understand the child's artistic expressions in ways that often eluded Jack. "Children see things differently than we do," Mrs. Chen had told him once, while Emma showed her a particularly detailed drawing of a lighthouse surrounded by stormy waves. "Sometimes they see things more clearly than adults who've learned to ignore what doesn't fit their understanding of the world." The comment had struck Jack as oddly profound, though he hadn't given it much thought at the time. Now, watching Emma through the window as she worked on yet another ocean scene, he wondered what his daughter might be seeing that escaped his own perception. The morning routine had become sacred to them both. Jack would wake before dawn, brew his coffee, and sit on the porch watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and amber. Emma would join him after her breakfast, settling into the oversized wicker chair that had been Sarah's favorite spot for morning reading. They would sit together in comfortable silence, Emma drawing, while Jack lost himself in the rhythm of the waves below. This particular morning felt different, though Jack couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Even the seagulls seemed subdued, their typical raucous calls replaced by an almost reverent quiet. "Ready for our walk, sweetheart?" Jack called through the screen door. Emma looked up from her drawing and nodded, carefully closing her sketchbook and sliding it into the small backpack she carried everywhere. She'd developed this ritual of bringing her art supplies on their daily beach walks, often stopping to sketch something that caught her attention. A particularly interesting piece of driftwood, the way morning light played across tide pools, or the patterns left in the sand by retreating waves. They made their way down the narrow path that wound through the dunes, past the wild roses and beach grass that whispered secrets in the ocean breeze. The beach stretched for miles in both directions, a pristine expanse of sand and scattered rocks that remained relatively untouched by development. During the summer months, families would drive from the larger cities to enjoy the unspoiled coastline, but in early autumn, Jack and Emma often had the entire beach to themselves. Pete Garrison, who owned the Anchor Inn diner in town, had told Jack stories about this stretch of coast that went back generations. According to local folklore, ships had been wrecking on these shores for over 2 centuries, drawn off course by mysterious lights and treacherous currents. The old-timers spoke of phantom vessels that appeared during storms, of ghostly figures walking the beach at dawn, and of voices calling from beneath the waves. Jack had always dismissed such tales as the kind of romantic nonsense that every coastal community seemed to generate. But lately, especially during their morning walks, he'd begun to feel something indefinable in the air, a sense of presence that had nothing to do with the visible world around them. This morning, as they reached their usual turning point near the cluster of tide pools, Emma suddenly stopped walking. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted as if listening to something Jack couldn't hear. Then, without warning, she broke into a run toward a section of beach they'd never explored before. "Emma, wait!" Jack called, jogging after her. She stopped about 50 yards ahead, kneeling in the sand beside what appeared to be a piece of driftwood. But as Jack approached, he realized it wasn't wood at all. Partially buried in the sand was a massive chain link, easily 6 inches across and forged from iron that had been turned rust-red by decades of saltwater exposure. The link was just the beginning. As Jack knelt beside Emma and brushed away more sand, he could see that the chain extended both deeper into the beach and out toward the ocean. Each link was identical in size and construction, suggesting this wasn't random debris, but part of something much larger and more purposeful. Emma had already pulled out her sketchbook and was drawing furiously, her small hands moving with practiced precision. Jack watched in amazement as she recreated not just the visible portion of the chain, but what appeared to be its continuation underwater, stretching into the depths toward some unseen destination. "How did you know this was here?" Jack asked softly. Emma paused in her drawing and looked up at him with those serious brown eyes. For a moment, Jack thought she might actually speak. Instead, she pointed toward the ocean and then placed her hand over her heart, a gesture that somehow conveyed more meaning than words might have managed. As they walked home later that morning, Jack found himself looking back repeatedly at the spot where they'd discovered the chain. Something about finding it felt significant in a way he couldn't explain, as if it had been waiting specifically for them to uncover it. The rational part of his mind insisted it was simply maritime debris, probably from some long-forgotten shipwreck. But as he watched Emma at lunch, carefully adding details to her drawing of the chain, Jack began to suspect that their discovery was only the beginning of something much more profound than he could have imagined. Jack couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the massive chain link stretching into the darkness of the ocean depths. At 3 in the morning, he gave up trying and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Emma sitting at the table with her sketchbook open, drawing by the light of a small lamp. "Sweetheart, what are you doing up?" he whispered. Not wanting to startle her, Emma looked up and pointed to her drawing, then to the window that faced the ocean. In the pale moonlight, Jack could just make out the shoreline where they'd discovered the chain. Emma had drawn the same scene from memory, but with startling detail that she couldn't possibly have observed during their brief morning visit. The chain in her drawing extended far into the ocean depths, connecting to what appeared to be a large structure, part ship, part building, part something else entirely. "Did you dream about this?" Jack asked gently. Emma nodded and continued drawing, adding intricate details to the underwater structure. Jack watched in fascination as she sketched what looked like a lighthouse, but one that existed beneath the waves rather than above them. The precision of her lines and the confidence of her strokes suggested she was copying something she could see clearly in her mind's eye. The next morning, Jack decided to return to the beach alone. Mrs. Chen had offered to watch Emma for a few hours, sensing that Jack needed time to process their discovery. Armed with a small spade and brush from his old archaeological kit, tools he'd used during his salvage diving days, Jack made his way back to the spot where they'd found the first chain link. In daylight, the partially buried metal looked even more impressive. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each link had been forged with decorative patterns along its edges, suggesting this wasn't merely functional hardware, but something of ceremonial or symbolic importance. Jack began carefully excavating around the visible portions, following standard archaeological protocols, despite his impatience to uncover more. What he found defied his expectations. The chain didn't simply lie buried in the sand. It descended at a deliberate angle toward the ocean, as if someone had carefully positioned it to connect the land with the sea floor. More disturbing was the realization that the chain appeared to be much longer than any practical maritime application would require. Jack followed its path for over 100 yards before losing the trail, where it disappeared beneath the waves. By afternoon, Jack's curiosity had overcome his caution. He drove into Millhaven's small downtown district, parking in front of the Historical Society building that occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Main Street. If anyone would know about the chain's origins, it would be Margaret Prescott, the Society's volunteer curator and unofficial keeper of the town's collective memory. Margaret greeted him with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely received visitors interested in local history. A retired high school teacher in her 70s, she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Millhaven's past and maintained meticulous records of everything from property deeds to ship manifests dating back to the town's founding in 1847. A chain, you say? Margaret's eyes lit up with interest. Found on the North Beach, near the tide pools? Jack nodded, surprised by her immediate recognition of the location. "Oh my, you've stumbled onto one of our oldest mysteries," Margaret said, leading him to a filing cabinet labeled Maritime Anomalies. She extracted a thick folder and spread its contents across a nearby table. "We've had reports of chain sightings going back over a century, never the same people twice, and always in roughly the same location." The documents were fascinating. Handwritten accounts from fishermen, typed reports from Coast Guard personnel, even a few grainy photographs from the 1940s showing portions of what appeared to be the same chain Jack had discovered. Most intriguing was a leather-bound journal that Margaret handled with particular care. This belonged to Ezra Blackwood, the lighthouse keeper from 1920 to 1923, she explained. He was the last person to tend the old lighthouse before it was decommissioned. According to his journal, he became obsessed with something he called the promise during his final months on duty. Jack opened the journal carefully, noting the water damage that had warped many of its pages. Ezra's handwriting was precise and methodical at first, recording routine lighthouse maintenance, weather observations, and ship sightings. But as the entries progressed, the tone became increasingly urgent and erratic. March 15th, 1923. "The chain calls to me again tonight. I can hear it singing beneath the waves, promising things that no mortal man should hope for. Clara grows weaker each day, and the doctors in Portland offer no hope. If the old legends are true, if the chain truly connects this world to the next, then perhaps there is still time to make the bargain." March 22nd, 1923. "I have spoken with Thomas Clearwater, the last of the old shamans. He warns me against what I contemplate, but he does not watch his beloved waste away while he stands helpless. The chain is not evil, he says, but it exacts a price for every miracle. I find myself beyond caring about the cost." March 30th, 1923. "Clara passed in her sleep last night. I held her hand as she went, feeling her spirits slip away like morning mist. But even as I grieved, I heard the chain calling to me more clearly than ever before. It promises reunion, promises that love need not end with death. I will follow where it leads." The journal entries ended abruptly after March 30th. According to Margaret, Ezra Blackwood had disappeared 3 days later. His body was never found, and the lighthouse was abandoned shortly thereafter. "What happened to the lighthouse?" Jack asked. Margaret led him to a window that faced north toward the coast. "You can still see the foundation stones if you know where to look. It stood on that rocky promontory about 2 miles from where you found the chain. The structure was demolished in the 1930s after repeated damage from winter storms, but local folklore claims it was haunted." Jack studied the distant coastline, trying to imagine the lighthouse that had once guided ships safely to harbor. What did the locals say about Ezra's disappearance? The official story was that grief over his wife's death had driven him to suicide, Margaret replied, but the old-timers told different tales. They said Ezra had made some kind of bargain with forces beneath the sea, and that on calm nights you could sometimes see lights moving underwater near where the lighthouse used to stand. Jack thanked Margaret and borrowed the journal, promising to return it within a few days. As he drove home, his mind raced with possibilities. The rational explanation was that Ezra Blackwood had suffered a mental breakdown following his wife's death and had either accidentally drowned or deliberately taken his own life. The chain was simply an unrelated piece of maritime debris that had been washing ashore periodically for generations. But as Jack pulled into his driveway, he saw Emma through the kitchen window, drawing with the same intense concentration she'd shown the night before. Mrs. Chen met him at the door, her expression troubled. "She's been drawing the same thing all afternoon," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "The lighthouse, Jack. She's been drawing a lighthouse surrounded by underwater lights, exactly like the one in that old photograph hanging in the library." Jack's blood ran cold. "What photograph?" "The one from 1922, showing the original lighthouse before the demolition." "But here's the thing. Emma has never been to the library, and I never showed her that photograph, yet her drawing is identical in every detail." Jack hurried to the kitchen, where Emma looked up from her work with those serious brown eyes. Her latest drawing showed the lighthouse from Ezra's time, complete with architectural details that would have been impossible for her to know. But more disturbing were the additions she'd made. Underwater lights forming a pattern around the lighthouse's base, and a figure in the beacon room, arms outstretched toward the ocean below. That night, Jack lay awake reading Ezra's journal. By lamplight, while Emma slept peacefully beside him, the lighthouse keeper's final entries painted a picture of a man desperate enough to attempt the impossible, driven by love and grief to seek supernatural solutions to mortal problems. As Jack read, he couldn't help but see parallels to his own situation. Like Ezra, he was a man who had lost the woman he loved, struggling with grief that threatened to consume him. Like Ezra, he was beginning to hear something calling to him from beneath the waves, not audibly, but as a persistent pull on his consciousness that grew stronger each day. The journal's final legible entry sent chills down Jack's spine. April 2nd, 1923. "I understand now what the chain truly represents. It is not merely a bridge between life and death, but a binding that holds souls to this world when they should have moved on. Those who follow it, seeking reunion with the departed, may find what they seek, but at the cost of trapping both spirits in an eternal limbo. Yet knowing this, I find I cannot turn away. The promise of seeing Clara again, even in such a state, outweighs my fear of the consequences. Tomorrow, I will follow the chain to its end and discover what waits in the depths. Jack closed the journal and looked out at the moonlit ocean, where waves caught the light like scattered diamonds. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the end of the chain that Emma had somehow known to find. Whatever had driven Ezra Blackwood to his fate was calling to Jack as well, and despite every rational instinct warning him to stay away, he knew with growing certainty that he would answer that call. The question was whether he possessed the strength to break the cycle that had claimed the lighthouse keeper, or whether he was destined to follow the same path into the depths where promises were made and prices were paid in ways the living could barely comprehend. The next morning brought an autumn storm that lashed the coast with driving rain and 30-foot waves. Jack stood at the kitchen window, watching the angry ocean through sheets of water that streamed down the glass. Emma sat at her usual spot at the table, but instead of drawing, she stared out at the storm with an expression of intense concentration, as if listening for something hidden within the sound of wind and rain. "Rough day to be on the water," Mrs. Chen observed, joining Jack at the window. She'd arrived early to help with Emma while Jack worked on boat repairs at the marina, but the storm had made travel impossible. Jack nodded, though his thoughts weren't on the practical concerns of the day. The storm seemed to have awakened something restless within him, a pull toward the beach that grew stronger with each thunderclap. Despite the dangerous conditions, he found himself calculating whether it might be possible to return to the chains. Location, to see how the violent surf might have changed its configuration. "You're thinking about going out there, aren't you?" Mrs. Chen said quietly. Jack looked at her in surprise. The elderly woman's perceptiveness had always impressed him, but this bordered on mind reading. "I can see it in your posture," she explained, with a gentle smile. "The same restlessness my late husband used to get before big storms. He was a fisherman, you know. Always felt the call of rough water, even when common sense said to stay ashore. Did he ever follow that call?" Mrs. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "Once, during a typhoon in 1987, he came back 3 days later with a story about lights beneath the water and voices calling his name. Never talked about it much, but he stopped fishing alone after that." Before Jack could ask what she meant, Emma suddenly stood up from the table and walked to the window. She pressed her small hands against the glass and began tracing patterns. In the condensation, the same curved lines and circular shapes that had dominated her recent drawings. "Emma?" Jack knelt beside her. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Emma continued her finger painting on the fogged glass, creating an intricate design that seemed to pulse with its own internal logic. As Jack watched, he began to recognize elements from her sketchbook: the chain, the underwater lighthouse, the flowing figures beneath the waves. But there were new details too, symbols and patterns that seemed almost runic in their complexity. Mrs. Chen gasped softly. "Those markings, I've seen them before." "Where?" "In my grandmother's journals. She was Makah from the reservation up north. Those symbols, they're part of the old stories about spirit chains and water guardians." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "What stories?" Before Mrs. Chen could answer, the lights flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by the grey stormlight filtering through the windows, Emma's tracings on the glass seemed to glow with a faint luminescence that shouldn't have been possible. The power outage lasted 3 hours. During that time, Jack found himself drawn repeatedly to the window where Emma's symbols remained visible on the glass. Mrs. Chen had grown quiet, muttering prayers in a language Jack didn't recognize while she watched Emma, who seemed completely unaffected by the darkness, and continued adding to her window artwork with calm precision. When the electricity finally returned, Jack made a decision that surprised him. He called Pete Garrison at the Anchor Inn and asked about hiring a babysitter for the evening. Despite Mrs. Chen's willingness to help, Jack felt he needed time alone to process what was happening to his family. "You could try Sarah Martinez," Pete suggested. "She's home from college for the semester, good with kids. Her number's in the book under Martinez Accounting." An hour later, Sarah Martinez knocked on their door. A pretty young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, she immediately put both Jack and Emma at ease. Emma, who typically remained wary around strangers, seemed to accept Sarah's presence without the usual period of cautious observation. "She's an unusual child," Sarah observed, watching Emma show her the window drawings. "Very artistic. These symbols, they remind me of something from my anthropology classes. You've seen markings like these before?" "Similar ones, yes. In coastal Native American traditions, there are stories about spiritual bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. These patterns," Sarah gestured to Emma's work, "they're remarkably close to some of the petroglyphs found near sacred sites." Jack felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in his mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. After ensuring that Sarah felt comfortable with Emma and had his contact information, Jack drove into town, despite the lingering effects of the storm. The Millhaven Public Library occupied a Carnegie-era building on Elm Street, its stone facade weathered by decades of coastal storms. Jack had visited occasionally over the years, usually to research maritime regulations or diving safety protocols, but tonight he sought something entirely different. Librarian Thomas Wright, a scholarly man in his 60s, helped Jack locate the Native American history section. "Looking for anything specific?" Thomas asked. "Stories about chains, underwater lights, spiritual bridges, Anything that might connect to local indigenous traditions. Thomas's expression grew serious. You might want to talk to Tom Clearwater. He's the cultural historian for the Makah tribe. Comes in here regularly to research his people's oral traditions. In fact, he was asking about similar topics just last week. What did he want to know? He was looking for any written records about what he called spirit anchors, ceremonial objects that were supposed to bind souls to specific locations. According to Tom, his great-grandfather was the last tribal member to understand how these anchors worked, and the knowledge died with him in the 1920s. Jack felt his pulse quicken. The 1920s, around 1923. Could be. Tom mentioned that his great-grandfather had some kind of confrontation with a lighthouse keeper who was trying to use indigenous spiritual practices for his own purposes. The tribal elders tried to warn the man about the dangers, but he wouldn't listen. The lighthouse keeper could only have been Ezra Blackwood. Jack thanked Thomas and spent the next 2 hours reading everything the library had about local tribal traditions. Most of the material was academic and dry, but one collection of oral histories contained references to the chain beneath the waters and warnings about promises made to the sea that bind the living to the dead. According to these accounts, certain powerful spirits inhabited the coastal waters, beings that could grant seemingly miraculous boons to those desperate enough to seek them out. But every such bargain came with a price that wasn't revealed until after the agreement was sealed. The spirits fed on the life force of those who made contracts with them, slowly draining their vitality while keeping them bound to the earthly realm. The most chilling passage described the fate of those who tried to break such contracts. The chain that binds becomes the chain that strangles. Those who seek to escape their bargains find that the spirits have woven their life essence into the very fabric of the binding. To break free means to lose not only what was gained, but often life itself. Jack was so absorbed in his reading that he lost track of time. When he finally looked up, the library was preparing to close, and darkness had fallen outside. He hurriedly checked out the books he'd been reading and drove home through streets still slick with stormwater. Sarah Martinez met him at the door with a concerned expression. "Emma's been asking for you," she said quietly. She became very agitated around sunset, kept pointing toward the ocean and making distress sounds. Jack found Emma in her bedroom, sitting on her bed with her sketchbook open to a page that made his blood run cold. She had drawn their house in precise detail, but with one disturbing addition: a figure standing on the beach below, arms outstretched toward their windows. The figure was too distant and indistinct to identify, but something about its posture suggested it was calling to them. "When did she draw this?" Jack asked Sarah. "About an hour ago. She seemed very upset while she was working on it, kept looking out the window as if she could see something I couldn't." Jack walked to Emma's bedroom window and peered out at the storm-darkened beach. The rain had stopped, but heavy clouds still obscured the moon and stars. He could see nothing unusual in the darkness below, yet he felt the same sense of presence that had been growing stronger each day. Emma tugged on his sleeve and pointed to her drawing, then to the window. She was trying to tell him something important, but without words. Her message remained frustratingly unclear. After Sarah left, Jack tucked Emma into bed and read her a story from one of Sarah's old books. As his daughter finally drifted off to sleep, Jack noticed something glinting on her nightstand, a small object that hadn't been there that morning. He picked it up carefully, recognizing it immediately despite having never seen it before. It was Sarah's wedding ring, the simple gold band that had been buried with her 2 years ago. Jack's hands trembled as he examined it, noting the familiar inscription inside: "Forever and always, S&J." But that was impossible. The ring was in Sarah's grave, 50 miles away in the Portland cemetery, where they'd laid her to rest. Jack had watched the funeral director place it on her finger himself, had kissed her hand one last time before the casket was sealed. Yet here it was, somehow in Emma's possession, covered with what appeared to be seaweed and smelling faintly of salt water. As Jack stared at the ring, he realized that whatever forces were at work here had moved far beyond mysterious chains and symbolic drawings. Something had reached across the boundary between life and death to return this token of their love. And Jack could no longer pretend that rational explanations would suffice. The ring was a message, a sign that Sarah was somehow aware of their situation and trying to communicate with them. But whether her presence was a blessing or a warning, Jack couldn't yet determine. All he knew for certain was that the chain on the beach had become the focal point of something far more powerful and personal than he'd ever imagined. Jack barely slept that night. Sarah's wedding ring sat on his nightstand, catching the moonlight that filtered through the bedroom curtains. Every few minutes, he found himself reaching for it, confirming its reality with his fingertips. The metal was cold, almost unnaturally so, and carried the unmistakable scent of deep ocean water. At dawn, Jack made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would return to the chain with proper excavation tools and follow it as far as possible. If Sarah was somehow trying to communicate with them through these supernatural events, he needed to understand what she was attempting to say. After breakfast, Jack loaded his truck with diving equipment he hadn't touched since his career ended. A wetsuit, diving mask, underwater lights, and the metal detector he'd used for locating lost cargo. Emma watched these preparations with intense interest, her sketchbook never far from her hands. "You want to come with me, don't you?" Jack asked, noting her focused attention. Emma nodded emphatically and pointed to her latest drawing, a detailed map showing the chain's path from the beach into deeper water, with specific landmarks that Jack recognized from his knowledge of the local seafloor. "How do you know what it looks like down there?" Jack asked gently. Emma opened to another page in her sketchbook, revealing a series of underwater scenes drawn with photographic precision. The images showed the chain descending through kelp forests, past rocky outcroppings, and into darker depths where strange lights flickered in the distance. Most remarkably, the drawings included marine life details that Emma couldn't possibly have observed, specific species of fish, coral formations, and even the texture of the seafloor sediment. Mrs. Chen arrived as they were preparing to leave, taking one look at Jack's equipment and immediately understanding his intentions. "You're going diving," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I need to follow the chain, see where it leads." Emma's drawings, they show things she couldn't know, places she's never seen. Something is guiding her, and I think it might be Sarah. Mrs. Chen examined Emma's sketchbook with growing amazement. These drawings, they're not the work of a 6-year-old. The perspective, the detail, the understanding of underwater environments, it's as if she's copying photographs. Jack nodded grimly. Or copying memories that aren't her own. They drove to the beach in contemplative silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning with unusual visibility underwater. The ocean was calmer than Jack had seen it in weeks, as if nature itself was cooperating with his investigation. Emma led them directly to the chain's location, though the storm had shifted sand and debris around the site. Jack spent an hour carefully excavating the buried links, following their path toward the water's edge. As he worked, he made a discovery that sent chills down his spine. Embedded in one of the larger chain links was a bronze medallion about the size of a silver dollar. The medallion depicted a compass rose, but instead of pointing to magnetic north, the needle was frozen in position, aimed directly toward the deepest part of the ocean. Around the compass's edge were symbols that matched the patterns Emma had been drawing on the window. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Jack asked Mrs. Chen. She examined the medallion carefully, her expression growing troubled. "My grandmother told stories about spirit compasses, tools used by shamans to navigate the boundary between worlds. According to the legends, they don't point to geographic directions, but toward spiritual destinations." Jack pocketed the medallion and continued his excavation. The chain extended much further than he'd initially realized, disappearing beneath the waves at a point where the water was about 20 feet deep, well within his diving capabilities, even after 2 years away. From the profession, Emma sat on a piece of driftwood, drawing steadily while Jack prepared his diving equipment. When he looked at her latest work, he found detailed instructions. A map showing the safest descent route, warnings about underwater currents, and even notes about marine life behavior that could affect his dive. "She's trying to help you, Mrs. Chen observed. "Whatever connection she has to this chain, she wants you to succeed." Jack suited up with the methodical precision that had kept him alive during hundreds of commercial dives. The cold Pacific water was shockingly clear, visibility extending much further than normal conditions would allow. As he descended along the chain's path, Jack felt a sense of familiarity that defied logic, as if he'd swum this route many times before. The chain led through an underwater landscape that matched Emma's drawings exactly. Kelp forests swayed in the current, their fronds creating cathedral-like spaces filled with filtered sunlight. Schools of rockfish parted before him, and harbor seals watched his progress with curious eyes. But it was the chain itself that captured Jack's attention. Each link was a masterwork of craftsmanship, forged with decorative patterns that seemed to shift and change as he examined them. The metal showed no signs of corrosion despite obvious age, and strange symbols appeared along its length. Some matching the medallion and Emma's drawings, others completely foreign to anything Jack had ever seen. At 40 feet deep, the chain passed through a grove of giant kelp that formed a natural tunnel. As Jack swam through this underwater passage, he experienced something that nearly caused him to panic. The sound of a woman's voice, barely audible above the ambient noise of the sea, calling his name. "Jack, follow the light. Trust Emma." The voice was unmistakably Sarah's, though distorted by water and distance. Jack spun around, searching for the source, but saw only the dancing shadows of kelp fronds and the play of sunlight through the canopy above. As he continued following the chain, Jack noticed that the water itself seemed different, cleaner, more luminous, as if infused with some form of energy. Marine life grew more abundant and vibrant the deeper he went, with species he'd never seen in these waters before. Tropical fish that had no business in the cold Pacific waters swam alongside native species, creating an impossible ecosystem that defied biological explanation. At 60 feet, the chain reached a ledge where the seafloor dropped away into much deeper water. Jack hovered at the edge, peering down into blue-black depths that his underwater lights couldn't penetrate. The chain continued into that darkness, but something about the descent felt ominous, as if crossing this threshold would commit him to more than just a deeper dive. Emma had drawn this exact spot, Jack realized, including warnings about not going deeper without proper preparation. Her childish handwriting had spelled out "danger" and "not yet" around the image of the ledge. Reluctantly, Jack began his ascent, following the chain back toward the surface. But as he rose through the kelp forest, he noticed something he'd missed during his descent. Other chains, parallel to the first, stretching across the seafloor like the spokes of an enormous wheel. Each chain was identical in construction, all leading toward the same dark depths where the first chain had disappeared. The implications were staggering. This wasn't simply one mysterious artifact, but part of a vast underwater structure that might span miles of ocean floor. Whatever lay at the convergence point of all these chains represented something far more significant than Jack had imagined. When he surfaced, Emma was waiting at the water's edge with a new drawing, Jack's dive depicted in precise detail, including elements he hadn't mentioned to anyone. She'd drawn the kelp tunnel, the tropical fish, even the moment when he'd heard Sarah's voice. But most remarkably, she'd drawn something Jack hadn't seen during his dive, a figure swimming alongside him, matching his movements and gestures like a protective guardian. The figure was unmistakably feminine, with long, flowing hair and features that even in Emma's childish artistic style resembled Sarah. She was there, wasn't she? Jack asked softly, kneeling beside his daughter. Emma nodded solemnly and pointed to the drawing, then to her heart, then to the ocean. The message was clear. Sarah's spirit was somehow bound to these waters, connected to the chains in ways that transcended normal understanding of life and death. Mrs. Chen examined Emma's latest artwork with growing concern. "Jack, I think you need to speak with Tom Clearwater as soon as possible. These drawings, they're showing you things that relate to tribal legends about spirit anchors and soul binding. If Sarah's spirit is caught in whatever supernatural web exists down there, there might be ways to help her, or there might be warnings you need to heed." As they packed up their equipment, Jack noticed that the bronze compass medallion had grown warm in his pocket. When he examined it, the needle had shifted position, no longer pointing toward the deep ocean, but toward the north, specifically toward the site where the old lighthouse had once stood. Emma saw him studying the compass and immediately began a new drawing. This one showed the lighthouse ruins at night, surrounded by underwater lights that formed a perfect circle around the rocky promontory. In the center of the light pattern stood two figures, a man and a woman holding hands as they gazed out over the dark ocean. Jack's breath caught as he recognized the figures. One was clearly Ezra Blackwood, based on photographs Jack had seen at the Historical Society. The other was a woman who could only be Clara, Ezra's dying wife, whom he'd tried to save through supernatural means. The drawing suggested that Ezra's desperate bargain had succeeded in some fashion. He and Clara were reunited, but not in the way he'd hoped. Instead of saving her life or joining her in peaceful death, they'd become trapped together in some liminal space between worlds, bound to the very chains that Ezra had thought would offer salvation. And if the pattern held true, Sarah might be facing the same fate, caught in a supernatural web that offered the illusion of continued existence while actually preventing her soul from finding peace. The question that haunted Jack as they drove home was whether he had the strength to help Sarah find release, even if it meant losing his last connection to the woman he'd loved more than life itself. The appointment with Dr. Marina Santos had been Mrs. Chen's idea, though Jack found himself surprisingly receptive to the suggestion. Emma's behavior was becoming increasingly complex. Her artistic abilities continued to develop at an impossible rate, and her apparent communication with supernatural forces was both fascinating and deeply concerning. Dr. Santos maintained her practice in a converted cottage on the outskirts of Millhaven, its garden filled with wind chimes and sculptures that created a soothing environment for children dealing with trauma. A woman in her 40s, with gentle eyes and prematurely grey hair, she specialized in selective mutism and had worked with dozens of children who'd stopped speaking after experiencing loss. "Emma's case is quite remarkable," Dr. Santos observed during their first consultation, reviewing the portfolio of drawings that Jack had brought. "The technical skill alone suggests an artistic gift far beyond her chronological age, but it's the content that's truly extraordinary." Jack watched Emma through the office window, where she sat in the garden drawing while they talked. "You don't seem skeptical about the supernatural elements." "I've learned not to dismiss children's perceptions too quickly," Dr. Santos replied. "Young minds are often more receptive to experiences that adults have trained themselves not to see. Whether Emma is receiving actual communication from her mother's spirit or processing grief through symbolic imagery, the important thing is that she's found a way to express what she's experiencing." Dr. Santos had reviewed Emma's complete collection of drawings with the thoroughness of both a psychologist and an art historian. Her analysis revealed patterns that Jack hadn't noticed, recurring symbols that appeared across multiple drawings, a consistent color palette that emphasized blues and greens, and most remarkably, a progression in the emotional content that suggested Emma was working through her grief in ways that transcended normal child development. "These underwater scenes," Dr. Santos said, pointing to several of Emma's oceanic drawings, "they're not frightening to her. The water represents connection rather than separation, which is unusual for a child who lost a parent in a vehicular accident. Most children in Emma's situation develop fears related to the cause of death, but she seems to find comfort in aquatic imagery. Jack shared the story of finding Sarah's wedding ring and the strange events surrounding the chain discovery. Dr. Santos listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. "I'd like to try something," she said, when Jack finished his account. "Art therapy can be particularly effective with children who've experienced trauma. If Emma is indeed receiving some form of communication, structured artistic expression might help us understand what she's trying to process." The session that followed was unlike anything Jack had expected. Dr. Santos provided Emma with professional-grade art supplies and asked her to draw whatever came to mind when she thought about her mother. What emerged over the next hour was a masterpiece that would have challenged a trained artist. Emma's drawing showed an underwater garden where human figures moved gracefully among kelp forests and coral formations. The figures were translucent, suggesting spirits rather than living beings, and they tended to marine life with the same care that Sarah had once given to her terrestrial garden. In the center of this underwater paradise stood a familiar figure, a woman with Sarah's distinctive features, wearing a flowing dress that seemed to merge with the surrounding water. She was tending to a garden of sea anemones and underwater flowers, her face serene and purposeful. "She's not trapped," Dr. Santos observed quietly. "According to Emma's perception, her mother has found a new form of existence, one where she can continue the nurturing activities that gave her life meaning." But as Emma continued working, darker elements crept into the drawing. Chains appeared at the edges of the underwater garden, and some of the spirit figures seemed bound by glowing links that prevented them from moving freely. The woman who represented Sarah kept glancing toward these chains with an expression of concern, as if aware of some threat to the peaceful realm she inhabited. "What do you think the chains represent?" Jack asked. Dr. Santos studied the drawing carefully. In psychological terms, chains often symbolize unfinished business or unresolved emotional connections. But Emma's rendering is remarkably sophisticated. She's depicting what appears to be a conflict between different spiritual forces. Emma added final details to her drawing, symbols that Jack recognized from the bronze medallion and the patterns she'd traced on their window. These symbols formed a border around the entire scene, as if creating a protective barrier around the underwater garden. "She's trying to protect her mother," Jack realized. "The drawings, the symbols, she's somehow working to keep Sarah safe from whatever force is represented by those chains." As if responding to his words, Emma looked up from her drawing and nodded solemnly. She pointed to the chained figures in her artwork, then made a gesture Jack had never seen before, placing both hands over her heart and then extending them toward the drawing, as if offering protection or blessing. Dr. Santos documented this interaction carefully. Emma understands far more about her situation than we initially realized. She's not just processing grief, she's actively engaged in what she perceives as a spiritual conflict. That evening, Jack sat in Sarah's old garden, now wild and overgrown, reading the additional materials Dr. Santos had provided about childhood spiritual experiences. The literature was surprisingly extensive, filled with case studies of children who claimed to communicate with deceased relatives and documented instances of young people demonstrating knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means. Emma joined him in the garden, carrying her sketchbook and a small object Jack hadn't seen before, a carved wooden pendant in the shape of a whale. The carving was exquisite, made from what appeared to be whalebone and etched with intricate patterns that matched the symbols from her drawings. "Where did you get this, sweetheart?" Jack asked, examining the pendant. Emma pointed toward the beach, then to her drawing of the underwater garden. In the original artwork, Jack now noticed a detail he'd missed earlier. One of the spirit figures was holding an identical whale-shaped pendant, offering it to the woman who represented Sarah. The Pendant was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a faint energy that reminded Jack of the bronze compass medallion. As he held it, images flashed through his mind, brief glimpses of underwater scenes that matched Emma's drawings, the sound of whale songs echoing through vast oceanic spaces, and most clearly, Sarah's voice calling his name with urgent affection. Jack, trust. Emma, she sees what you cannot. The whale knows the deep paths. The voice faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Jack shaken but oddly comforted. Emma watched his reaction with those serious brown eyes, then took the pendant back and hung it around her neck. The carved whale settled against her small chest as if it belonged there. Over the following days, Emma's behavior changed in subtle but significant ways. She began responding to questions with gestures and expressions that conveyed complex meanings, and her artwork evolved to include instructional diagrams that seemed designed to guide Jack's next steps. One drawing showed the location where multiple chains converged beneath the ocean, with detailed notes about optimal diving conditions and safety precautions. Another depicted the old lighthouse site with arrows indicating where foundation stones might still be found. Most remarkably, she created a series of portraits showing Jack in diving gear, but with the whale pendant visible around his neck, as if suggesting that Emma's spiritual connection could somehow protect him during underwater exploration. Mrs. Chen noticed the changes immediately. "She's becoming more herself again," she observed during one of her daily visits. Not the silent, withdrawn child she was after the funeral, but not quite the chatterbox she was before either. "She's becoming something new, older, wiser, but still fundamentally Emma," Jack agreed, though he found Emma's newfound maturity both comforting and unsettling. At 6 years old, she seemed to possess an understanding of mortality and spiritual matters that some adults never achieved. When she looked at him now, Jack felt as if she was seeing not just her father, but his deepest fears and hopes laid bare. The whale pendant seemed to play a crucial role in Emma's transformation. She wore it constantly, sometimes holding it while she drew or pressing it against her forehead when she appeared to be listening to something only she could hear. On several occasions, Jack noticed the pendant glowing faintly in the evening light, though he couldn't determine whether this was a supernatural phenomenon or simply the effect of reflected sunlight on polished bone. One morning, Jack woke to find Emma standing at the kitchen window, still in her pajamas, holding the whale pendant and staring fixedly at the ocean. When he joined her, she pointed toward the water and began drawing rapidly on a piece of paper she'd brought with her. The drawing showed the beach at sunrise, but with an addition that made Jack's breath catch: a figure walking along the shoreline, arms outstretched as if calling to them. The figure was clearly feminine, with long hair that flowed in an unfelt wind, and wore a dress that seemed to merge with the morning mist. "Is that Mama?" Jack asked gently. Emma nodded and continued drawing, adding details that brought the scene to vivid life. She drew herself and Jack standing at their window, watching the figure on the beach. But most significantly, she drew the whale pendant glowing brightly, with lines of light connecting it to the mysterious figure walking by the water's edge. As Jack watched Emma work, he realized that his daughter had become more than just a witness to supernatural events. She had become an active participant in whatever spiritual drama was unfolding around their family. The whale pendant, the symbolic drawings, her sudden artistic abilities, all of these suggested that Emma was being prepared for some crucial role in resolving the conflict between Sarah's spirit and the forces that sought to bind her. The question that haunted Jack was whether a 6-year-old child, no matter how gifted or spiritually sensitive, should be expected to carry such a burden. Yet as he watched Emma's confident, purposeful movements as she drew, he began to suspect that she might be far better equipped for this challenge than he was. That afternoon, while Emma napped, Jack made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. He would attempt another dive, this time following the chains to their convergence point, regardless of the depth or danger involved. But he would not go alone. He would carry Emma's whale pendant with him, trusting in whatever protection or guidance it might provide. As he prepared his diving equipment, Jack found himself remembering Sarah's voice from his underwater vision. "Trust Emma. She sees what you cannot." Perhaps his daughter's supernatural insights were not a burden to be protected from, but a gift that could guide them both toward whatever resolution this mystery demanded. The message in a bottle, washed ashore on a Tuesday morning, carried by unusually high tides that deposited it precisely at the spot where Jack and Emma had first discovered the chain. Emma found it during their morning walk, pointing excitedly at the green glass vessel half buried in wet sand. Jack extracted the bottle carefully, noting its age and the wax seal that had somehow remained intact, despite obvious time in the water. Inside was a rolled paper, yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved. Emma watched with intense concentration as Jack broke the seal and unrolled what appeared to be a letter written in faded ink. The handwriting was immediately recognizable from Ezra Blackwood's journal, though these words carried a desperation that made Jack's hands tremble as he read, "To whoever finds this message, my name is Ezra Blackwood, and if you are reading these words, then the bargain I made has failed, and my soul remains bound to the chains beneath the lighthouse. I write this with my final moments of clarity, before the sea spirits claim what remains of my sanity. Clara died as I held her hand, and in my grief, I sought the old magic that the Maka shamans warned me against. The chain beneath our lighthouse is not merely iron and rust. It is a soul anchor, forged by powers that exist in the spaces between life and death. I offered my life in exchange for Clara's restoration, believing that love could triumph over mortality's natural order. But the spirits that dwell in the deep places do not understand human love. They accepted my bargain, but twisted its meaning. Clara's spirit was indeed called back from whatever realm claims the dead, but not to rejoin the living. Instead, she became bound to the soul anchor, neither alive nor truly dead, trapped in an existence that is mere shadow of true life. I realize my error too late. To free her, I would have to break the anchor itself, but doing so would release all the souls that have been bound to it over the centuries, including my own, once the spirits claim me. I have not the courage for such sacrifice, and so I damn us both to eternal binding. If another soul becomes entangled in this web, know that the anchor can be broken, but only by one who loves selflessly enough to sacrifice their own spiritual connection to the bound soul. The chains will call to the grieving, offering reunion with the lost. But true love means choosing the beloved's peace over one's own comfort. May God forgive me for my selfishness, and may whoever follows this path possess the courage I lacked. The letter was signed with Ezra's name, followed by a date, April 3rd, 1923, just one day after his final journal entry. Emma had been watching Jack's face as he read, and now she reached out to touch the letter with gentle fingers. As soon as her skin made contact with the aged paper, her eyes widened and she gasped, the first sound she'd made in weeks that wasn't related to drawing or gesturing. "Mama," she said clearly, her voice rusty from disuse but unmistakably purposeful. Jack knelt beside her, hardly daring to breathe. "What about Mama, sweetheart?" Emma pointed to the letter, then to her whale pendant, then to the ocean. "Mama, help others." The words came slowly, as if she was remembering how to shape them with her voice. "Chains, bad. Mama, good." It was the longest sentence Emma had spoken since Sarah's funeral, and the meaning was clear. Sarah's spirit was somehow aware of the soul anchor's true nature and was working to help other trapped souls find release, even though doing so might cost her own continued existence. That evening, Dr. Santos made a house call to document Emma's breakthrough. The child's return to speech was remarkable enough, but her apparent understanding of complex spiritual concepts defied conventional psychological explanation. "Emma, can you tell me more about Mama?" Dr. Santos asked gently, recording the session. Emma nodded and began to speak in halting but increasingly confident sentences. "Mama not gone. Mama in water garden. Help other mamas and papas who lost. But chains hurt Mama. Chains keep everyone stuck." "What do the chains want?" Emma's expression grew troubled. "Chains hungry, eat love. Make people stay when should go to light place." Dr. Santos exchanged glances with Jack, both recognizing the sophistication of Emma's description. "How do you know about the light place?" "Mama show me, in dreams. Light place where love goes after bodies stop. But chains trick people, make them stay in dark water instead." Emma pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing as she talked, creating images that illustrated her words with startling clarity. She drew the soul anchor as a massive underwater structure surrounded by chains that glowed with malevolent energy. Trapped spirits floated around the anchor, their forms dimmed and distorted by their bondage. But at the edges of the drawing, Emma depicted something new, streams of pure light flowing down from above, representing the souls that had found release from their chains. Among these ascending spirits, Sarah's figure was clearly visible, helping guide others toward the light. "Mama, learning how to break chains," Emma explained, pointing to her drawing, "but need help from people who still have bodies, need Papa to dive deep, find anchor, make it stop hurting people." Jack felt a chill of recognition. Emma's childish language was describing the same choice that Ezra's letter had outlined. The need for someone to sacrifice their own spiritual connection to a bound soul in order to free all the trapped spirits. "Emma," Jack said carefully, "if Papa helps Mama break the chains, what happens to Mama?" Emma's expression grew sad but determined. "Mama go to light place. No more hurt, no more stuck, but no more visits either. Mama say it okay. Love stays even when people go to light." The implications were staggering. Sarah's spirit was asking Jack to help her find peace, even though it would mean losing all possibility of future contact. Unlike Ezra, who had been too selfish to sacrifice his connection to Clara, Sarah was willing to accept true death in order to free herself and others from spiritual bondage. Dr. Santos spent another hour with Emma, documenting the child's remarkable recovery and her apparent ability to perceive spiritual realities. When she finally prepared to leave, she pulled Jack aside for a private conversation. "I've worked with traumatized children for 15 years, she said quietly, "and I've never encountered anything like Emma's case. Whether you believe in literal spiritual communication or not, she's processing complex philosophical concepts about love, sacrifice, and the nature of existence. Her recovery is extraordinary." "Do you think she's really in contact with Sarah?" Dr. Santos considered the question carefully. "I think Emma has found a way to understand her mother's death that allows her to function and even thrive. Whether that understanding comes from actual spiritual contact or from her own remarkable psychological resilience is less important than the fact that it's working." After Dr. Santos left, Jack sat with Emma in Sarah's old garden, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. Emma was drawing again, but these were different from her previous works. Lighter, more hopeful, filled with ascending figures moving towards sources of brilliant light. "Are you ready to help Mama?" she asked, looking up from her drawing. Jack studied his daughter's face, seeing Sarah's determination reflected in those serious brown eyes. "Are you ready to say goodbye to her?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Mama not really gone. Love stays forever. Just different kind of love. Not hurt kind, not stuck kind. Free kind." That night, as Jack tucked Emma into bed, she pressed the whale pendant into his hands. "For diving," she said simply. "Mama's friends in water help Papa be safe." Jack closed his fingers around the carved whale, feeling its strange warmth and the sense of protection it seemed to emanate. Tomorrow, he would attempt the deep dive that Emma's drawings had been preparing him for. He would follow the chains to their convergence point and confront whatever supernatural force had been binding souls to eternal suffering. But for tonight, he sat beside his daughter's bed, listening to her breathe peacefully and marveling at the courage she'd found to help both her parents, the living and the dead, face the most difficult choice of their existence. Jack's deepest dive began at dawn, when the ocean lay still as polished glass and Emma's latest drawing promised optimal conditions for reaching the soul anchor. He'd spent the previous evening checking and double-checking his equipment, knowing that this descent would push him far beyond the recreational diving limits he'd observed since leaving commercial salvage work. The house that awaited them was no longer a monument to loss, but a home filled with possibility. Emma's artwork covering the walls, plans for the Maritime Heritage Centre spread across Jack's desk, and Sarah's garden blooming with renewed life. Under their shared care, tomorrow would bring ordinary concerns, work, school, friendships, and the thousand small decisions that comprise a healthy life. But tonight, as Jack tucked Emma into bed and listened to her prayers of gratitude for their extended family and their healing journey, he knew they had found something more valuable than supernatural reunion with the dead. They had found the courage to live fully among the living, carrying love as a source of strength rather than a burden of sorrow. The weeks following their sunset ceremony brought a series of small but significant changes that marked the completion of Jack and Emma's transformation. The supernatural elements that had defined their recent existence faded completely, replaced by the rich complexity of ordinary life lived with extraordinary appreciation. Emma's integration back into normal childhood progressed remarkably. Her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, marveled at the change in her students' engagement and social skills. "It's as if she's discovered not just her voice, but her confidence," she told Jack during a parent conference. "Emma has become a natural leader among her classmates, especially when they're dealing with difficult emotions." Indeed, Emma had developed an unusual gift for helping other children process their feelings through art and storytelling. When a classmate's grandfather died, Emma organized a memory-sharing circle during recess. When another child struggled with his parents' divorce, Emma created a collaborative drawing project that allowed him to express his confusion without words. "She has an old soul," Mrs. Chen observed one afternoon while watching Emma teach her friend Sophie how to draw ocean waves, but not in a way that makes her seem burdened. "She's wise without being weary." Jack's own adjustment to post-supernatural life took longer, but proved equally profound. The Maritime Heritage Centre project had grown beyond his initial expectations, attracting interest from marine biologists, environmental educators, and tourism boards throughout the Pacific Northwest. His expertise in underwater environments, combined with his newfound ability to discuss the emotional aspects of ocean relationships, made him an unexpectedly effective educator. "You speak about the sea differently than most divers," noted Dr. Rebecca Chen, a marine biologist from Oregon State University who had come to discuss potential research partnerships. "There's a reverence in your approach that goes beyond technical knowledge." Jack had indeed developed a different relationship with the ocean, one that honored both its natural power and its role in his family's healing journey without requiring supernatural intervention. His diving expeditions now focused on conservation efforts and educational documentation, work that felt both personally meaningful and professionally satisfying. The community response to their story continued to evolve in positive directions. The annual memorial flower ceremony that Emma had initiated was officially adopted by the town as a community healing event, with Dr. Santos providing grief counseling resources and local churches offering interfaith support for families dealing with loss. Pete Garrison had commissioned a local artist to create a memorial plaque for the beach where they'd found the chain. The inscription suggested by Emma read, "In memory of all who love so deeply that they struggle to let go, and in celebration of love that finds the courage to set free what it cherishes most." But perhaps the most significant development was Emma's decision to write and illustrate a children's book about their experience. Working with Dr. Santos to ensure age-appropriate content, she created a story about a little girl who learns to say goodbye to her mother's spirit by helping other lost souls find peace. The Chain of Light, as Emma titled her book, used metaphorical language to convey complex themes about grief, love, and letting go. The underwater scenes became dreamscapes, the supernatural elements became symbolic journeys, and the central message focused on the courage required to choose healing over clinging to the past. This could help other children who've lost parents. Dr. Santos told Jack as she reviewed Emma's manuscript, "Emma has found a way to normalize both intense grief and the possibility of recovery. That's a gift not many adults possess, let alone children." The book's illustrations demonstrated Emma's artistic development as well. Her technical skills continued to advance, but more importantly, her subject matter had expanded to include the full spectrum of human experience: joy, friendship, learning, growth, and yes, appropriate sadness that didn't overwhelm the other emotions. One evening in late November, as the first winter storms began to build off the coast, Jack found Emma in her room working on the final illustrations for her book. She was drawing a family scene, father and daughter sitting together on a porch, watching a sunset over calm water, while in the sky above them, barely visible but unmistakably present, a figure made of clouds and light offered a gentle blessing, before fading into the natural beauty of the evening sky. "Is that the ending?" Jack asked, settling into the chair beside Emma's desk. Emma nodded, adding final touches to the cloud figure's serene expression. "The mama spirit gets to say one last goodbye, and then she becomes part of the beautiful things that the girl and papa can see every day. Sunsets and ocean waves, and the way light dances on water." "That's a perfect ending," Jack said, meaning it completely. Emma set down her pencil and looked at her father with those wise brown eyes that had guided them through their darkest period. "Papa, do you miss the magic, the dreams and the voices and the way things glowed?" Jack considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I miss feeling like I had a direct connection to Mama, but I don't miss the sadness that came with it, or the way it made everything feel desperate and scary." "Me too," Emma agreed. "The magic was beautiful, but it wasn't supposed to last forever. It was just supposed to help us learn how to be okay without it." That night, after Emma had gone to sleep, Jack sat on the porch, where he and Sarah had shared countless quiet evenings. The ocean stretched before him under a canopy of stars, looking exactly as it should. Vast, powerful, mysterious in natural ways, but no longer supernatural or threatening. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jack found himself able to remember their life together without the overlay of desperate longing or crushing guilt. He could recall her laughter without needing to hear it echoing from beyond the grave. He could appreciate her love without requiring ongoing supernatural proof of its continuation. The memories were enough, not because they filled the emptiness left by her absence, but because they had taught him how to build a different kind of fullness. Sarah's love lived on in Emma's compassion, in Jack's renewed capacity for connection, in the community they'd helped create around shared healing, and in the simple daily choices they made to honor life while accepting loss. A gentle wind stirred the ocean air, carrying the salt scent that would always remind Jack of the morning when their supernatural journey began. But tonight, that scent spoke only of natural beauty and the eternal rhythms of a living planet. No messages from beyond, no mystical guidance, just the peaceful presence of a world where love and loss coexisted without requiring miraculous intervention. Jack smiled, understanding finally that this ordinary magic, the kind that emerged from human courage, community support, and the choice to heal rather than cling to pain, was more reliable and ultimately more powerful than any supernatural force they had encountered. Inside the house, Emma slept peacefully, her dreams filled not with visits from spirits, but with plans for tomorrow's adventures, next week's art projects, and the bright future that stretched ahead of them both like an ocean of possibilities under starlight. 6 months after the sunset ceremony, Jack and Emma returned to the beach for their morning walk, a routine that had evolved from desperate searching to peaceful contemplation to simple pleasure in shared time. The spring morning was crisp and clear, with gentle waves lapping against sand that showed no trace of the supernatural chain that had once emerged from its depths. Emma carried her sketchbook as always, but her subjects had changed completely. Today, she was documenting the tide pools they'd discovered during their exploration, drawing hermit crabs and sea anemones with the same precision she'd once applied to underwater spirits. Her artistic gift remained extraordinary, but it now served natural curiosity rather than supernatural compulsion. "Look, Papa," Emma said, pointing to a cluster of mussels that had formed an intricate pattern on a partially submerged rock. "They make shapes just like the patterns I used to draw, but they're real patterns, nature patterns." Jack studied the formation Emma had noticed, recognizing in its spiral arrangement an echo of the symbols that had once covered her sketchbook pages. But where those earlier drawings had carried urgent mystical significance, this natural pattern simply offered beauty for its own sake. "You're right," Jack said, watching Emma capture the mussel colony's geometry with confident strokes. "The ocean has always been full of patterns and mysteries. We just needed to learn how to appreciate them without needing them to mean more than they naturally mean." Their walk continued along the familiar shoreline, but now they moved with the relaxed pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing desperate to find. Emma collected interesting shells and stones, adding them to a growing collection that filled several mason jars in her bedroom. Jack simply enjoyed the rhythm of waves and the pleasure of watching his daughter engage with the world around her. The Millhaven Maritime Heritage Center had officially opened the previous month, with Jack serving as its first director of education and underwater programs. The center occupied a renovated warehouse on the harbor front, featuring interactive exhibits about local marine ecosystems, maritime history, and ocean conservation. Emma had contributed several of her nature drawings to the children's section, including a series about tide pool creatures that had become popular with young visitors. "Mr. Halden's daughter is an amazing artist," Jack overheard a teacher telling her class during a recent school field trip. "She shows us that you can learn about the ocean by really looking at it, not just reading about it in books." Emma had beamed with pride at the compliment, but Jack noticed that her satisfaction came from sharing knowledge rather than receiving attention. She'd developed into a natural teacher, helping younger children identify marine life and explaining the importance of treating ocean creatures with respect. The success of the Heritage Center had brought unexpected opportunities. National Geographic was considering a feature article about community-based marine education, and the State Tourism Board had included Millhaven in its promotional materials for educational travel destinations. But for Jack, the most meaningful recognition came from former colleagues in the diving industry who noted the unique perspective he brought to underwater education. "You talk about the ocean like it's a living community," observed Captain Rita Valdez, a commercial diver who'd visited the center to see Jack's programs. "Most of us treat it like a workplace or a challenge to overcome. You found a way to teach respect without losing the sense of wonder." Jack's relationship with the ocean had indeed evolved into something more nuanced than his earlier approaches. As a young commercial diver, he'd seen it primarily as an arena for professional achievement. During his grief period, it had seemed like a supernatural realm offering impossible reunions. Now he understood it as both workplace and cathedral, a natural environment that demanded respect, offered beauty, and provided endless opportunities for learning and growth without requiring mystical intervention. Emma's development continued to amaze everyone who knew her. Her book, The Chain of Light, had been accepted for publication by a small press specializing in children's grief resources. Dr. Santos had written the foreword, explaining how Emma's story could help other children understand that healing from loss was possible without forgetting the people they'd lost. "I want to dedicate the book to Mama," Emma had told Jack during the final editing process. "Not because she's gone, but because her love helped me learn how to help other kids who are sad." The dedication, when it appeared in print, read, "For Mama, who taught me that love grows stronger when we share it, and for all the kids who are learning that missing someone doesn't have to mean being stuck in sadness forever." Mrs. Chen had become an official member of their family, though no legal papers had ever been signed. She helped Emma with homework, shared cooking duties with Jack, and served as the kind of wise elder that both father and daughter had needed during their healing process. Her own background, growing up between cultures, losing her husband to the sea's dangers, raising children while navigating grief, had given her perfect preparation for guiding the Halden family through their transformation. "You two have taught me something important," Mrs. Chen told Jack one evening while they watched Emma play in the garden. "I thought that getting older meant accepting limitations, learning to want less from life. But watching you both choose healing over bitterness, growth over stagnation, you've shown me that resilience doesn't have an expiration date." Indeed, Mrs. Chen had begun volunteering at the Heritage Center, sharing stories about her late husband's fishing experiences and helping Jack develop exhibits about the human cost of maritime work. Her contributions added emotional depth to displays that might otherwise have focused only on technical or historical information. The community that had formed around their experience continued to thrive. The annual memorial flower ceremony had attracted families from throughout the region, becoming a recognized event for anyone dealing with loss. Dr. Santos had established a year-round support group that met monthly, providing ongoing resources for families navigating grief. But perhaps the most significant development was Emma's announcement that she wanted to pursue marine biology when she grew up, combined with art therapy training so she could help children express difficult emotions through creativity. "I want to understand both parts of what we learned," she explained to Jack. "The science part, about how the ocean really works, and the feelings part about how people really work when they're sad or scared or confused." At 7 years old, Emma was already demonstrating the integrated approach she envisioned. Her nature drawings combined scientific accuracy with emotional resonance. Her interactions with other children balanced factual education with empathetic support, and her processing of their family's experience had transformed personal trauma into community resource. As their morning walk neared its end, Jack and Emma paused at the spot where they'd first discovered the chain that changed their lives. The location showed no trace of its former significance, just sand, scattered shells, and the ordinary debris that beaches accumulate and release with each tide cycle. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found the chain?" Emma asked, settling onto a piece of driftwood to add finishing touches to her tide pool drawings. Jack considered the question while watching seabirds dive for fish in the deeper water beyond the shore break. "I think we would have found some other way to heal eventually, maybe not as dramatic. Probably taking longer, but I believe people who love each other always find ways to help each other heal." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "The chain wasn't really magic, was it? It was just a way for us to learn things we needed to learn, but didn't know how to learn by ourselves." "That's very wise," Jack said, struck once again by his daughter's ability to understand complex truths. "Sometimes we need unusual experiences to teach us ordinary lessons about love and letting go and building new kinds of happiness." As they gathered their belongings for the walk home, Emma made one final addition to her sketchbook, a simple drawing of herself and Jack walking together on the beach, their shadows stretching behind them while their faces looked toward a horizon full of possibility. In the sky above them, barely visible but definitely present, she drew a small, heart-shaped cloud, offering not supernatural intervention, but natural blessing on their continued journey. "That's perfect," Jack said, reviewing Emma's work. "A little bit of Mama's love in the natural world, but not taking over our lives or making us sad." Emma smiled and closed her sketchbook, slipping it into the small backpack that had carried so many supernatural mysteries and now held only the ordinary treasures of a child exploring her world with healthy curiosity and appropriate wonder. As they walked up the beach path toward home, Jack reflected on the transformation that had brought them from desperate grief to integrated healing. They had learned that love doesn't end with death, but it does change form, from direct presence to cherished memory, from supernatural connection to natural inspiration, from desperate clinging to generous sharing. The house that awaited them was no longer a shrine to loss, but a launching pad for future adventures. Emma's artwork covered the walls. Jack's diving certifications and Heritage Center plans filled his office, and Sarah's garden bloomed under their joint care as a living memorial that celebrated growth rather than mourning stagnation. Most importantly, they had discovered that healing doesn't mean forgetting or getting over loss, but learning to carry love as a source of strength rather than a burden of sorrow. Sarah's influence continued in every act of kindness Emma showed to other children, every moment of courage Jack found to build new relationships, and every choice they made to honor life while accepting its natural limitations. Their supernatural journey had ended exactly where it needed to, not with magical reunion or mystical revelation, but with the quiet courage to live fully among the living while keeping love alive in forms that blessed rather than bound them. Behind them, the ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, speaking in languages older than human grief and newer than hope, reminding anyone who chose to listen that love, like water, always finds a way to flow toward its proper destination.